Those who deplore his subsequent repudiation of the vow explain his defection on the ground that he ought never to have taken it. Had he ever been a true monk, he would not have abandoned the cowl. His critique of monasticism is made to recoil upon himself, in that he is painted as a monk without vocation, and the vow is interpreted not as a genuine call, but rather as the resolution of an inner conflict, an escape from maladjustment at home and at school. A few sparse items of evidence are adduced in favor of this explanation. They are not of the highest reliability because they are all taken from the conversation of the older Luther as recorded, often inaccurately, by his students. And even if they are genuine, they cannot be accepted at face value because the Protestant Luther was no longer in a position to recall objectively the motives of his Catholic period. Really, there is only one saying which connects the taking of the cowl with resentment against parental discipline. Luther is reported to have said, "My mother caned me for stealing a nut until the blood came. Such strict discipline drove me to the monastery, although she meant it well." This saying is reinforced by two others. "My father once whipped me so that I ran away and felt ugly toward him until he was at pains to win me back. At school I was caned in a single morning 15 times for nothing at all. I was required to decline and conjugate and hadn't learned my lesson." Unquestionably, the young were roughly handled in those days, and Luther may be correctly reported as having cited these instances in order to bespeak a more humane treatment, but there is no indication that such severity produced more than a flash of resentment. Luther was highly esteemed at home. His parents looked to him as a lad of brilliant parts who should become a jurist, make a prosperous marriage, and support them in their old age. When Luther became a Master of Arts, his father presented him with a copy of the Corpus Juris, and addressed him no longer with the familiar du, but with the polite si. Luther always exhibited an extraordinary devotion to his father, and was grievously disturbed over parental disapproval of his entry into the monastery. When his father died, Luther was too unnerved to work for several days. The attachment to the mother appears to have been less marked, but even of the thrashing he said that it was well intended, and he recalled affectionately a little ditty she used to sing. "If folk don't like you and me, the fault with us is like to be." The schools also were not tender, but neither were they brutal. The object was to impart spoken knowledge of the Latin tongue. The boys did not resent this because Latin was useful, the language of the church, of law, diplomacy, international relations, scholarship, and travel. The teaching was by drill punctuated with the rod. One scholar, called a lupus, or wolf, was appointed to spy on the others and report lapses into German. The poorest scholar in the class every noon was given a donkey mask, hence called the asinus, which he wore until he caught another talking German. Demerits were accumulated and accounted for by birching at the end of the week. Thus one might have 15 strokes on a single day. But, despite all the severities, the boys did learn Latin and loved it. Luther, far from being alienated, was devoted to his studies and became highly proficient. The teachers were no brutes. One of them, Trebonius, on entering the classroom, always bared his head in the presence of so many future burgomasters, chancellors, doctors, and regents. Luther respected his teachers, and was grieved when they did not approve of his subsequent course. Nor was he prevailingly depressed, but ordinarily rollicking, fond of music, proficient on the lute, and enamored of the beauty of the German landscape. How fair in retrospect was Erfurt! The woods came down to the fringes of the village to be continued by orchards and vineyards, and then the fields which supplied the dye industry of Germany with plantings of indigo, blue-flowered flax, and yellow saffron. And nestling within the brilliant rows lay the walls, the gates, the steeples of many-spired Erfurt. Luther called her a new Bethlehem. Religious disquiet. Yet Luther was at times severely depressed, and the reason lay not in any personal frictions, but in the malaise of existence, intensified by religion. This man was no son of the Italian Renaissance, but a German born in remote Thuringia, where men of piety still reared churches with arches and spires, straining after the illimitable. Luther was himself so much a Gothic figure that his faith may be called the last great flowering of the religion of the Middle Ages, and he came from the most religiously conservative element of the population, the peasants.